pass over that. We were in the same year at college together, Cambridge. We both studied history. My only appearance, no, I have two appearances in novels. My only fictional appearance as a student was in Sebag's first book, a book called King's Parade, where I appear as a rather unattractive character called Drippy Macduff's Whittle, who's a kind of paedophile Arabist. Well, we made up after that, and Sebag is one of those annoying contemporaries, we all have them, whose career accelerates until they shoot past you. You can just see it in the distance. And I think it's fair to say that Sebag's career as a writer went into fourth gear with his two remarkable Stalin books, which moved him from being an important biographer to being an international bestseller, whose extraordinary books on Stalin have, how many languages? About 40 languages, and bestsellers in very many of them, in almost every East European language, every post-Soviet. What's extraordinary is that many of us work away on biographies and histories, and by taking characters who haven't been studied much, can discover new angles on history. Irritatingly, Sebag has taken one of the most written about characters in modern history, Joseph Stalin, and totally changed the way people everywhere in the world look at this central figure of the 20th century. I don't think the books are as well known in India as they should be, and I'm very pleased that Sebag was able to make it this year. We asked him last year and he couldn't make it, and he's finally come this year. He is not only a great writer and an extraordinary biographer, he is, I have been told, a very, very fine speaker. And he wanted to do a conversation, but I insisted that he should do a lecture and just talk as he's about to do for 45 minutes on Stalin. I should say quickly that the two books, one was, the first one to come out was The Court of the Red Tsar, which was about the court of Stalin at the peak of the power, at the peak of the purges, this extraordinary group of grotesques he gathered around himself. Then he went backwards to do Stalin's youth, and again discovered extraordinary facts, and a whole, not just a few facts, but a whole range of information which had been overlooked or forgotten or no one had bothered to dig up. And how you can find new material about something like Joseph Stalin, I can barely imagine, but Sebag is about to tell us. Please welcome, big hand, Simon Sebag Montefiore.
Thank you very much, William. That was a lovely introduction, far too generous. But it is strange that this is actually the first event we've ever done together in the last 30 years. So this is historic in a whole nother realm. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and William too. Thank you very much for inviting me to Jaipur. It's lovely to be here, and a lovely audience. Thanks for coming. Joseph Stalin is, as William said, one of the titanic figures of the 20th century who helped make our world as it stands today, for better or for worse. As you know, there are people in Russia today who regard him as probably the greatest and most successful Tsar Russia's ever had, who increased the Russian Empire all the way from Korea to Berlin. And he's constantly in a process of semi-rehabilitation. He will, in the end, I think, be regarded in Russia as Stalin the Great, one of those figures like Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, who are regarded as sort of heroic monsters, but great rulers nonetheless. And as you know, President Putin, Prime Minister Putin now, has sponsored a textbook which describes Stalin as one of the greatest statesmen, most successful statesmen, along with Peter the Great, and compares him to Bismarck. So that's one side of it. But for many other people in the world, Stalin remains the great monster, the psychopath, and probably the greatest killer, along with Chairman Mao and Adolf Hitler. There are a whole lot of other people, of course, who have no idea who Stalin is anymore, and who should know who Stalin is. I remember when I turned up at an American mall recently to promote my book, in America, one of those malls full of very fat Americans with huge shorts. And I remember queuing up to sign the book, and where a woman was going to announce me. And when she looked at the bit of paper that's announced the book, and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome Joseph Stalin here, who is going to sign copies of his book, Simon Montefiore, a biography." When I started researching Stalin, I went down to Georgia a lot, and that's how I started getting interested in Stalin during the breakup of the Soviet Union, and where I made many of the contacts that were very helpful in getting into the archives later. And when I went down there, I found in the marketplace a huge oil painting of Stalin, and there he was in his marshal's uniform, binoculars in his hand, looking out over the wondrous wheat fields and prairies of the Ukraine, where about 20 combine harvesters were threshing the wheat of the Soviet Union. And I bought this picture for about $100. It's one of the best investments I ever made, because it's an original oil painting. Anyway, I brought it back, and I had it framed. And when I was staying with my parents, and they brought in the picture framed, the local framer, and as he took the picture in, he said, as he passed my father, he said, "I can see the resemblance to your father." So, I presume it's your grandfather. So anyway, he also probably needs a little bit of education. Now, one of the reasons, I was extremely lucky when I started this book. I first of all wrote a book about Catherine the Great and her lover Potemkin. Working in the Russian archives is one of the most bizarre experiences, because they're the only archives in the world where the archivists generally, there are a few exceptions, generally are determined to stop you finding anything at all. But they will do just about anything to scupper and sabotage you. And I remember when I first arrived to study Catherine the Great and Potemkin, I said to the woman there, a very sulky lady, I said, "By the way, I hear there's a room full of love letters of Potemkin and Catherine. Where is it?" She said, "It doesn't exist." But anyway, later I found there was an entire hall full of these love letters, which they were hiding from me. And when I first sat down to read them, I heard a terrible screeching, and a kitten landed on my head, dropped by this lady from the gallery. So, I don't know if this happens when you're studying Indian archives, but I don't think it does. So that was an experience. But this book was wonderful because Putin was just coming to power. He was looking for a sort of template for enlightened despotism. And therefore, they liked this book on Potemkin. And therefore, they gave me access to the Stalin archives, which they were just opening then. It could have been anybody who had access to them. It just happened that I was there. But this was an amazing plus, because it meant I got my own room. I got as many documents as I wanted. Everybody helped me. And they also told many old people who are now dead that they should speak to me, people who knew Stalin well. And so that was an amazing opportunity. When I published the book, which I'm going to describe in a minute, they hated it. A new authoritarian era had opened in Russia. And in fact, my portrayal of Stalin was extremely inconvenient to them, and they hated it. And therefore, I was kind of blacklisted. And as I said the other day when I was talking about biography, I've really experienced both the warm glow of the sunlight, of the favor of the Kremlin, and also the cold, freezing wind of Kremlin disfavor, like the wind from Siberia. And so when I went back and said, "Can I have my room back? Can I work again on the same documents? And can you help me again?" to the lady in charge, she said, "I don't remember you. What room?" And so I realized I'd returned back to where I started. And when I said, "Can I have some documents?" they said, "I'm afraid there's been an accident." Two soldiers guarding because they're all Minister Interior, places guarded by the Minister Interior, they said, "I'm afraid two soldiers got very drunk last night and fell down the lift shaft. And it's going to take us several weeks to remove the bodies. And during that time, I'm afraid you'll be unable to receive any documents." So, of course, this is very Russian. Because everything in Russian is half conspiracy and half accident. And I never found out which it was. So, when I came to write Young Stalin, the second of my books, I had very little access in Moscow. But I was very fortunate that I was able to find, mainly through the contacts I'd made in Georgia, a whole new archive of Stalin material about his youth. about his bank robberies, about his love affairs, and even the memoirs of his mother that have been hidden for a very long time. And there hangs a tale. Because when I was working in the Stalin archives in Moscow, I found Stalin's incredibly irritated comments about his mother. His mother was very like him. She was a formidable character. And she would give interviews to Pravda in the 30s, which read a bit like the sort of Soviet Stalinist equivalent of interviews with Hello magazine, in which she would say that Stalin was a wondrous boy with a huge smile, and the journalist would describe her lovely room she lived in and what a wonderful twinkling old lady she was. And Stalin, who both needed and craved the cult of personality about himself, also hated it and despised its necessity. And therefore he was immensely irritated by these interviews. And so he wrote a memo, which I found in the Russian archive, in the Moscow archives, saying on no account are any more interviews to be done with my mother. And anybody who does interviews with my mother is to be arrested. And so no more interviews were done with his mother after that. This was in 1936, just before the Great Terror. So it was not a time you wanted to disobey orders. But his mother had other ideas. She was one of those people who did exactly what she felt like, Kiki. In fact, whenever she saw Stalin, she would say deeply inconvenient things to him. One time she said to him, why can't you just run Russia with Trotsky? Why do you have to argue with him? And another time she said to him, she said, what is your job? And he said, I'm first secretary of the Communist Party. She said, what does that mean? A secretary? She said, no, it means I'm like the Tsar. And she was silent for a little bit, and then she said, wouldn't it have been better to become a priest? So on this occasion, Kiki did exactly what the hell she felt like. She wanted to leave her memoirs, and if the interviews were banned, then she would arrange to leave her own memoirs. So she recorded them herself, she dictated them, and they were typed up. They were given to the archivist in Tbilisi, capital of Georgia. Now this is one of those terrible moments in the life of a Soviet bureaucrat, because here he had the order from Stalin saying that no one was to record an interview with this woman, and here is the woman giving you the interview. So what do? The way to lose it is to file it, and you file it in the wrong place. And this is what happened. He took the mother's memoirs, and he filed them under Old Bolsheviks' memoirs miscellaneous. And there they remained for 60 or 70 years until the 1990s. So just a little example of how the archives work over there, and how you can get lucky by putting your hand into files called miscellaneous. Now, I just want to say a little bit about the sort of nature of these archives. When I started to work on these archives, I dreamed of writing about Stalin since I was a child. And when I started to look into the archives, I found the most exciting, the excitement of finding this stuff is something that actually makes your hands shake. In these archives were materials that were both funny, sometimes shocking, often desperately sad, often preposterous, sometimes heartwarming. There were love letters between Stalin and his wife, Nadia, in which he called her Tatka, and they read like the love letters of a normal couple. There were also wonderful letters in which Stalin actually tries to persuade members of his Politburo to support him at difficult times in his career. And to read these letters, you would never realize that this man is going to become the greatest murderer and tyrant of all time. He apologizes quite often. He said, I'm terribly sorry for losing my temper with you the other day. I'm under a lot of pressure. Will you support me? Will you help me? Please don't resign. This sort of thing. The kind of thing you might see in a normal politician's letters. And one of the things I realized very quickly was that Stalin's rise to power was in a very small party. There were only about 5,000 active members of the Bolshevik party when they came to power. But even though it was an oligarchy, Stalin still had to perform normal politics. And in this way, he was a people person. He would help his leaders in all sorts of ways to win their favor. One of the things I found in the archives was that he would personally assign the number of cars to each member of the Politburo by hand every year. So he would say, Dalrymple, a Packard, 2 Rolls-Royces, and a Buick. And it would be written down in his hand. And this just gives you an idea. Every apartment was chosen by him. And he would arrive in the apartments of his leaders and say, Is everything happy? Can I have a look? Is the fridge good enough? If not, I'll get you another one from General Electric, and so on. So, in many ways, this was a normal politician, a machine politician, but perhaps on paper not that different from someone at Tammany Hall, for example, in New York. Of course, underneath the regime was a vast mechanism of repression, the secret police. So that was one part of it. As the terror started, one began to see Stalin constantly writing to his fellow leaders, encouraging them to kill more people. And the killing was by quota, and the lists are in the archives. And these lists actually say 100,000 people in Bryansk are to be killed by quota. Isn't that extraordinary? There's no naming. The leaders were expected to kill the right people. And the amazing thing is, of course, is they killed the wrong people, because they didn't want to kill the people around them in their own entourages. So they killed everybody else. They killed people who were already in trouble. And then when they'd killed them, Stalin would send down another quota, saying kill another 50,000. And in the end, they would still kill the wrong 50,000. So he would then send down someone from Moscow, and they would kill the leader and his entire entourage as well. This is all in the archives there, in lists, between himself and Yezhov, the secret police chief. So some of this material is heartbreaking. Some of it, you find letters of people begging for their lives from Stalin. And in these letters, Stalin would sometimes write at the top, put it in my own archive. And that's why it's preserved. But then there was a lot of fun stuff, too. There are letters in which the leaders are constantly organizing holidays, and they're obsessed with where they all go on holiday. And, of course, they all want to go on holiday near Stalin. And rather like the writers here, all desperately trying to stay in the right hotel, they're all desperate to reserve the right villa near Stalin as they arrange their holidays in Georgia, in Sochi, in the Crimea. So many of the letters are about that. And, of course, then there are many letters about the children. Now, Stalin had terrible trouble with his children. He loved his daughter, Svetlana, who was just like the mother, Kiki. But his son, Vasily, was appallingly behaved, a real tearaway, an early alcoholic from his teens, completely irrepressible and uncontrollable. And Stalin quite often has to write to the teachers to say, punish this child. He's behaving like a prince's son, and I want him disciplined just like anybody else. At the same time, Svetlana is his pride and joy. He spends a lot of time with her. He signs her homework every evening. And one of the things that I found in the archive that I thought was just amazing was the Svetlana file letters in which she pretends, age 7, to be the dictator of Russia. And Stalin, Molotov, and the whole Politburo play along with this. And so she writes, Svetlana Stalin, age 7, first secretary of the Communist Party, to the Politburos, my second secretary, Stalin, Molotov, etc. I hereby order that all homework should be banned in the Soviet Union for a year. And amazingly, they all signed it, and they stuck it up on the board in their flat. And these bits of paper are still in the archives. So a huge variety of material there. And in fact, in a way, so much material that one could, for the first time, one always described Stalin as this kind of monster, this diabolic figure, this icy Mephistophelian giant. And now one could sort of, reading hundreds of these bits of paper, one could come to understand this man a little bit. Now, what I want to do, rather than just talk about his career in general, I just want to give you a taster of one night in his life that was incredibly decisive, and that will give you a picture of the way the leaders lived. Now, this is an event that Stalin, in a way, never recovered from. In another way, it didn't cause everything that came after, as is often said. It didn't cause the terror. It didn't cause Stalin to become Stalin. But it certainly made him more so. And that night, I want to take you back to the 8th of November, 1932. It's a time when Stalin is involved in the greatest crisis of his career. The Soviet Union is committed to collectivization on a vast scale, but the peasants are resisting. 10 million of them, as Stalin admitted himself to Churchill, will die in this process. And Stalin is under immense pressure. He's barely sleeping. Many members of the Communist Party itself have turned against him. And he is literally fearful for his career and fearful for the Soviet Union. And in fact, if it had not been Stalin in charge of the Soviet Union at this time, 1932, I think no other leader would have kept the Soviet regime in place. I think it would have fallen then. And perhaps that would have been a very good thing. But as it happened, Stalin was in power, and he was determined to stick to collectivization, whatever the cost. And that night, November the 8th, was the day of the Revolution Party and parade in Moscow. A huge parade of soldiers went past the mausoleum. Stalin reviewed them with his leaders, and not only with his leaders, but some of their wives and with their children too. And they all waved at the tanks and the soldiers. And afterwards, there was a huge party every year. And this party was given in the Kremlin. By the way, behind the mausoleum, where you often see them, there was a room where they had drinks. So the leaders used to often get very drunk when they were reviewing the troops. It's amazing none of them fell off the mausoleum. They got so drunk. But on this occasion, they went back to Voroshilov, Marshal Voroshilov's house, in the Horse Guards' apartments in the Kremlin. And there they had a party. Now, they had all the usual Georgian food at this party. There were many other guests. There were about 25 guests. Stalin sat at the head of the table. He always appointed a tamada, a Georgian toastmaster. Children ran in and out. Drink toasts were made. And the party started happily. Now, Stalin's wife was called Nadia. It was said that he'd first met her when he saved her from drowning in Baku about 30 years earlier. When he came to Moscow, or he came to Petrograd in 1917, he met her again. It was also said that he'd had an affair with her mother, which is quite likely. And some people later said that he was therefore her father. But the dates don't actually come together. But it is likely that he had affairs with both the father and the mother and the daughter. Not the father, I don't think. And that may be another archive I haven't discovered yet. So he met Nadia. Now, Nadia is normally presented, if you've read most Stalin biographies written before the late 90s, before the papers were revealed, you would regard her as the angel of this story, the perfect woman, the perfect mother, who was simply destroyed by the most brutal man, the most brutal husband you can imagine, Stalin himself. And there is some truth in this. The fact of the matter is that when we read the archives and we study the case, we realize something quite interesting about Nadia. Nadia was a manic depressive. Nadia was a schizophrenic and a hysteric, a neurotic hysteric, as they called it at that time. And she was herself an incredibly difficult person to be married to, even if you weren't the ruler of the Soviet Union. One could also say that we can hardly imagine a less sympathetic place and a less sympathetic marriage in which to be a schizophrenic, manic depressive, than to be in the Kremlin at the height of this macho, brutal, repressive time and married to Stalin himself, the man of steel. So this woman, when she fell in love with Stalin, she was 16, by the way, and he was almost 40. And they started their affair, and they married. They had 2 children, who I mentioned already. And she was a very independent person. She was probably a good person. She supported the Kremlin regime. She was a communist. She was a Bolshevik. So she believed in it all. But now, in the 30s, she too began to have doubts about the pace, the cost of collectivization that her husband was following. And her husband, who found any criticism very difficult to take, found it especially difficult to take at home. But having said that, she was also an exhausting person to be married to. She would lose her temper with him. She would shout at him. She would throw stuff at him. She would literally start to bawl and beat his chest. And at one time, he wrote a note to Khrushchev, who was at that time his party leader, saying, you know, I don't know what to do. When I get home, I sometimes have to run into the bathroom and lock the door. She just bangs on the door and screams at me for hours. So this is a bit of an unusual picture of the man of steel, isn't it? A bit of an unexpected thing. But then this marriage is unexpected. They also had very happy times. And I mentioned that he used to call her Tatka. And she called him Joseph, or So-So sometimes, or sometimes Cobra. But they had lots of nicknames for each other. And in these love letters, to read these love letters, again, you would not imagine that you were reading love letters from Stalin. In fact, I had to check that they were to and from Stalin. Because these love letters are examples where she would say to him like that. Actually, there's even sexual references in them, where she says something like, I would love to come and see you. Come up here. We'll have some fun like we did last time. Do come up and come up to my room. Other times she would say to him, you know, when I'm longing to kiss you again like you kissed me the last time we saw each other for a long, long time. Please may we do that again. And so on. So these are like the love letters of a normal couple. Now, they also had terrible times together. Stalin was the most unsympathetic husband you can imagine. He was the sort of man who sucked the air out of a room. I think he was the most egocentric character imaginable, and therefore the least nourishing for someone of her psychological neediness. And I think that their marriage began to have terrible tensions, just at the time that the political tensions were intensifying. Now, Stalin also was no angel, by the way. He was a typical Georgian man. He had mistresses. There are plenty of sort of examples, still secret, but almost certainly true, of him meeting girls. And in fact, his letters are filled with letters from women who sent photos of themselves to him. And oftentimes, he wrote back jocular replies, and they often used rather clumsy Bolshevik method of seduction, which was to say, "Dear Comrade Stalin, I'm an enormous admirer of yours. I've written a paper on the peasant agricultural situation in the Donetsk region. May I please show you this document, and you could advise me as my editor." And then she'd sign it, Natasha, and then it would say, "P.S. Photo enclosed." So, and Stalin would sometimes meet these people, and there were affairs, and of course there were a multitude of villas and dachas where this could take place. So there'd been a big flirtation. The biggest affair he'd had that we know of was with the Kremlin hairdresser. And Molotov was still talking about this many, many years later. I should tell you well about the Kremlin. I mentioned they went into the Kremlin. Some of you probably think of the Kremlin as a single building. It's not. It's a 70-acre village of palaces, churches, squares, towers, fortifications. And the Kremlin leaders, at this time, all lived together in two buildings that were next to each other. The Horse Guards building, and Stalin lived in the Poteshny Palace, which was a very adorable little palace that still exists. They all lived there together, and they all ran in and out of their houses like a family. People would literally Stalin would often send his children round to the Mikoyans or the Molotovs or the Voroshilovs for a cup of sugar. And there are constant stories of them coming into each other's houses, back and forth. So what you really have there is a family situation, a sort of family compound. But, of course, they were politicians. And so, like politicians, they were all secretly rivals. They had endless long histories. They'd been in prison together over 30 or 40 years. And they often had affairs with each other's wives in those days in the underground period. And what you have in these rivalries, this bitterness, these beautiful squares and palaces and buildings, with the bitterness and hatreds and jealousies of intimate life, is very similar to academic life in a Cambridge or Oxford college, even today. The only difference was that the cost of losing one of these feuds in the Kremlin was far more costly. So when they had these dinners after the November the 8th parade, they would all gather in somebody's house, and this time it was the Voroshilovs' house. And the Voroshilovs had known the Stalins for 30 years, and the party started happily. Now, all the leaders were there. Ordzhonikidze, one of Stalin's oldest friends and Politburo member, was the Tamada, the toastmaster. Voroshilov was already drunk from an early part of the dinner. Marshal Budyonny, a Cossack with a huge handlebar moustache, who was one of Stalin's a clique from the Battle of Stalingrad, the first Battle of Stalingrad in Tsaritsyn in the Civil War, was there, and he was very drunk too. All of these men were extremely macho, ruthless ex-revolutionaries. Some of them had spent as many as 30 years in the underground, with no hope of the Bolshevik Revolution ever happening. And this was very true of Stalin himself. One has to realize, people sometimes said to me, do you think he'd ever believed in communism? Do you think he ever believed in Marxism? When he became a Marxist underground revolutionary when there was no hope in the future of revolution succeeding. And in fact, it was 19 years before the communists actually came to power. And during that time, he faced many, many exiles in Siberia. He was almost killed many times. He did many desperate things. He launched bank robberies for the party. He spent were not opportunists. The opportunists came later. These people were absolutely dedicated. And people who knew Stalin well said that Stalin's devotion to Marxism, or Marxism-Leninism, was that of an Islamic fundamentalist. And they wrote this a long time. They wrote this at the time. They said he had all the fanaticism of a Muslim fundamentalist. So he was a believer from the beginning. They all were. By the way, when you imagine them, they all carried pistols at this time. The machismo, they would go out on expeditions to the countryside, these men, to break the back of the peasantry. Earlier that day, Stalin had a meeting with Yagoda, the secret police chief, extremely sinister character, an ex-chemist, an expert on poisons. And they, with the other leaders, had met earlier in the day to plan the destruction of the peasantry, the defeat of the peasantry, of whom 10 million were starving at that very moment. And in this meeting, we have letters from them talking about it. And they constantly talk that their only mission was to break the back of the peasantry. The peasantry was going to have to be destroyed. So they were in the business at this very time of killing massive numbers. And these leaders, with their Mausers on their belts, in their boots and their military tunics, would go out into the countryside with huge armed brigades and take the grain and the bread from the peasants, who they would then leave to starve. If they resisted, they were killed. So there was a semi-civil war going on in Russia. And now we're looking at the very apex of power in that country. So and by the way, Moscow was still very, and the Kremlin itself, of course it was guarded, but it was still very, very informal at this time. And Stalin himself walked back from that meeting with Molotov and others through the Kremlin. And one time when Stalin was walking back, with just a couple of bodyguards walking behind him, one time when he was walking back, a beggar came up and asked for some money. And Stalin gave him a coin, or asked his bodyguard to give him a coin. And the beggar cursed him and said, "You vile bourgeois." And Stalin reflected on this and said, what a strange thing the Russian people are. So anyway, the dinner had started. At one end was Stalin. Next to him was a very beautiful actress who was married to one of the top generals. And Stalin started to flirt with this woman. At one point, the toasts were made, and the toast was to the collectivization in the countryside. And when Stalin drank, he noticed that his wife, Nadia, did not drink. So he called down the table, and he said, "Hey you, why aren't you drinking?" And she replied, "Don't call me hey you. Don't call me hey you." Then she got up and she started to dance with her uncle and a godfather, Abel Yenikidze, one of Stalin's closest pals. Stalin was very irritated by this, and he started to flirt even more with the actress next to him. And at this point, she looked at him and she started to shout at him, announce him for flirting with her. And Stalin ignored it, but he often said to friends, you know, I cannot stand being married to this woman in this situation. And his other friends there later said it was very difficult for Stalin, a great challenge for him to remain married to this woman. But anyway, he then started to flirt with the actress even more intensely. He did so in what I can only describe as a rather coarse and unchivalrous manner. He threw balls of bread at her. Hardly a great romantic, but the balls of bread did their work. And the actress started to flirt with him heavily, and his wife became increasingly furious. And finally, at the end of the evening, she walked out. She said, "I'm not putting up with this. I can't stand it anymore. I'm walking out." And she went and walked around the Kremlin with Molotov's wife, who tried to calm her down. And she was saying, "I can't believe why he did this. I don't know why he behaves like this. It's so appalling. I can't take it anymore." And then there was that hairdresser, and now this. And so she denounced him like this. And Molotov's wife, who was devoted to the cause, tried to calm her down. When she got back, Stalin had disappeared. He'd gone on partying to one of the dachas, and it was said that the actress' wife, who was sitting next to him, had gone with him. She was furious again. She said, "How could he do this?" She called him. She called the dacha on the phone, but the bodyguards said, as they were trained to do, "Comrade Stalin is not here. Comrade Stalin can't come to the phone." She went to her room. She looked at the presents she'd received when her brother had just been in Berlin. The first thing she wore, the first present she was actually wearing, it was a rose applique dress, very pretty. Usually Bolshevik women dressed in sacks, to look as proletarian as possible. But in this case, she dressed up for the evening. She'd even put a rose in her hair. Stalin had ignored her. And now she closed the door, and she began to look through another, more fateful present that her brother had brought her back from Berlin. Later that night, Stalin came back to the apartment, probably in the early hours, probably at 2 or 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning, as was his wont. He was a nocturnal creature. And when he came back, he knew she was sleeping in her room. He knew there'd been a row, so he went and slept in the spare room. The children, incidentally, were out at the dacha, the Zubalova dacha, his country house at this time, with their nannies. And he went to sleep in the thick walls of the Poteshny Palace. And sometime in the night, Nadia lay down on the bed, and she lay on her side, and she reached for the present that her brother had brought her from Berlin. A little very feminine present that she just wanted to keep in her bag. It was a lady's pistol, a Mauser, very small, with an ivory handle. And she'd asked her brother, Pavel, to get her a dress, some clothes, and this little female pistol. After all, everyone else, every other wife in the Kremlin had their own pistol. This was a military government at war with its own people. So there was nothing untoward about asking for this present. But of course, Stalin never forgave his brother-in-law for bringing this little present with him back from Berlin. She lay on her side, and then she lay down. While she lay down, she started to write a note, and it was a terrible note accusing Stalin of many things. We've never found the note. Stalin destroyed it afterwards, as I'll explain. But she left it on the dresser, and then she turned over again, and she shot herself through the heart with the pistol. Her body rolled off the bed, and the blood spread on the floor. This was sometime in the middle of the night. Stalin was fast asleep. Everyone in the house was fast asleep. And in the morning, the housekeeper came in to wake her, because Nadia Alliluliyeva, Stalin, always woke early, and she found her dead there. And it was a terrible moment. What do you do when the wife of the most powerful man in your world, the fearsome Joseph Stalin, is dead? Who is to tell the first secretary? So the housekeeper called the colleagues. Remember, they were all right next door. So it took a minute to run across the courtyard and get the next person. Within minutes, literally minutes, Molotov, Olzhonikidze, Mikoyan, Yenukidze, the one her godfather who'd been dancing with her, were all in the room. And they were all standing looking at this terrible sight. What to do? Stalin slept on in the room next door. And finally, Abul Yenukidze and a couple of the other leaders decided that they would have to wake Stalin and that they would have to tell him. I should add that Abul Yenukidze was later executed by Stalin. Anyway, now he went in and he opened the door. Stalin was asleep. He woke him and he said, "Joseph Vissarionovich, Nadia is gone. Nadia is dead." Stalin couldn't believe it. He got up and he ran into the room and he looked at the scene and he took the letter, and they gave him the letter. He read the letter, and he later said he was heartbroken by it. He also later said he could not believe that she would leave him to look after the children on his own. And he also blamed her and said it was a betrayal. She betrayed me. So he looked at it both ways. Sometimes he felt sorry for himself. Other times he blamed her as a traitor to him and the cause for committing suicide. And they were holding there a small glass of Valium drops, Valerian drops, the sort of Valium of the 1930s. And they were just pouring it out. Stalin ran over and he got the bottle and he just swigged from it. And he said, "I'm feeling absolutely desperate." He went into his room. He spent 3 days in that room. And he lay on his side there. And when somebody went into the room to try and see him, they were worried that he would commit suicide. So they started, all the women in the family moved into the house. And they were to live in the house throughout the 30s, watching over him. So his house, in fact, became more of a feminine household. And the person who went in there went back in a few hours later. And Stalin had literally not moved from that position. And the wall was covered in spit. And he was spitting on the wall as he lay there, watching it roll down the wall. He'd been doing it for many hours. And when he came out, he said to the party members, I can't go on as first secretary of the party. I cannot go on as leader. And frankly, I cannot go on living. I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill myself also. As you know, he did go on living. And this story is just meant to be a small introduction to Stalin. Some people said that the terror was caused by this incident. It's not true. There would have been a terror whether Nadia lived or not. Her influence was negligible in that way, in fact, anyway. Some people said that Stalin became a psychopath because of this. I doubt that too. It was just one of the crises. But I think in 1932 was the year that made Stalin see that he needed the terror. Because all around him, even in his own household, he'd seen betrayal and people bending before the necessities of politics. But one effect that it did have is that it made Stalin even more abnormal as a person. And it made him despise women. He never had an equal relationship with a woman again in his life, though he had other affairs. And he was always distrustful of women. One of the peculiar features of the terror was that he frequently murdered the wives of his leaders while keeping the leaders themselves in power. And that's a fascinating aspect of it, and I'm convinced that that is caused by this experience. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is just a small introduction, a glimpse, if you like. If anyone would like to ask any questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you.
Before questions, I hate to say it, that was the most bravura performance. Not a single note, not a single hesitation. Just. The gentleman standing up at the end. Palash? Yes, Palash.
Thanks. Simon, you might be aware of a great essay that Pankaj Mishra wrote a few years ago about India's love affair with Stalinist and indeed Maoist regimes, and with the character and person and politics of Stalin and Mao. I wonder, have you had conversations with Indian intellectuals about this, and what is your take on Stalin's reception in India?
That's a very interesting question. I know actually quite a few Indians of a certain generation where one brother's called Stalin and one brother's called Lenin, and I'm sure you know some of those too. When they go to the West, they normally change their names to Len and Stan. But of course, I have had discussions with Indians. I think that's a fascinating aspect, that obviously there is a strong communist party here, and as well as a great socialist tradition in India, and people tell me that the respect for Stalin has lasted here much longer than it has in the West. So that is an interesting, fascinating, and I know you've had communist governments in some of the states here in Bengal and so on. So I think that's fascinating. But of course, Stalin's biggest influence, most direct influence today, is still in Russia, and of course in North Korea, which remains an entirely Stalinist state. And the only place where you can still see, at the funeral the other day of Kim Jong-il, there were Stalin limousines carrying the body, you might have seen. And that remains the last purely Stalinist state in the world.
Hi, my name is Kapiljeet Singh. I have a question. G.B. Shaw said that autobiographies are lie, if I'm correct. Is this the case with the biographies also?
Are they hard?
Yeah, autobiographies are hard, and I think that biographies are hard. You're asking if they're hard.
Yeah. G.B. Shaw said that autobiographies are lies. Autobiographies are lies. Yeah. Is this the case with the biographies also?
Okay, yeah. Did everyone hear that?
Repeat it.
Yeah. He said, G.B. Shaw said autobiographies are all lies. Is this also true with biographies? Yeah, finally, thank you. Well, I hope not. So I wasted a hell of a lot of time if that is the case. But of course, you know, the struggle with something like Stalin is, you know, what I wanted to do with these books was, I didn't want to just take on board either the Stalin's cult of personality, which he created himself, in which he's the greatest man that ever lived, and also, on the other hand, the Cold War demonization of Stalin as the most diabolical monster that ever lived too, but just to find the reality. And that's a challenge for a biographer and a historian, because some people would say by showing his human side that I would be humanizing him and apologizing for him. But I personally think that the challenge is to show the life, a typical day in the life, so that you can judge for yourself. Let me give you an example. Suppose Stalin made his children breakfast in the morning, and then sent them off to school, and then visited a school where he spoke to the children for hours about the wonders of Soviet housekeeping. But then after that, he met his daughter back from school and signed her homework and gave her supper. And then after that, he had dinner with his comrades and signed the death lists of 400,000 people. I think most readers can see which of those, can make the correct judgment about which of those acts they should make a moral judgment about. But I think people are still fascinated by the fabric of life in the Kremlin. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to show how he came to power, how the system worked, and what it was like to live there for them. And those were my aims. And I hope I've got it accurate. But of course, it's a huge challenge to get this right. Yeah.
Hi, my question is, was there any evidence in the archive that you looked at about how a man could have such polar consciousness? For one moment he was in love with his wife and flirting with her, and then the same evening, like you just mentioned, he would sign the death of 100,000 people. Do you think this is, I know this is the most common comparison, but was it close to Hitler's theory of like the human race, where he wanted to destroy peasantry and that kind of thing?
Well, I think it is. You know, I don't know about you and your schools, but I was always taught. We were sort of taught in England that Hitler and Stalin were just madmen. We were just told that, weren't we? There was no explanation about why they got like that, how they got like that, where they got to power. Funny enough, Stalin spoke about this himself, because recently there's been an autobiography come to light, a memoir of one of his leaders, and just in 1945, after the war, just after Hitler's suicide, they went to the country together. And this guy said to him, he said, "Comrade Stalin, was Hitler mad or was he bad?" And Stalin, very interestingly, Stalin said, well, he certainly wasn't mad, because he managed to keep tight control of the German nation. He managed to be elected, and he managed to keep control of everything right until the last days in Berlin. And no madman could do that, said Stalin. It's a very interesting comment, because you've got to realize you cannot write about either of these people, disgusting as they were, without realizing that they undoubtedly had certain political talents. And these were not the talents of a madman. And you know, that is the thing, the crux of the point of Stalin. He was an exceedingly talented person. He was also a deeply morose, vicious, brutal person. But he absolutely believed in what he was doing at all times. And all the Bolsheviks, by the way, believed in killing massive numbers of people at random, by quota, by class, in order to improve the world and create, move progress towards the perfection of history.
Why was that? What was the theory? Why was it good to kill hundreds of thousands of people?
It was simply the necessary cost. It was simply the necessary cost needed to do this, and they recognized that. And terror, they studied the French Revolution. They were completely open about it. Terror was absolutely essential. And this wasn't just Stalin. All of the leaders who were later killed themselves by Stalin had already accepted the killing of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. And Lenin himself said, what's the point of revolutions without firing squads? Yeah, the lady next to her, yeah.
They say Hitler killed people for who they were, Stalin for what they did, and Mao for what they thought. Which one was the worst? in your opinion?
I don't know. I think, you know what I think? Interesting story I heard recently, because there's always the quotation that's applied to Stalin that, you know, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. You may know that expression. It's probably one of his most famous quotes. But for the life of me, in the last 20 years, I could never find who he'd said it to and where he said it. And the other day I heard on the radio Mary Soames, Churchill's surviving daughter, being interviewed. And she was talking about this. Someone said to her, you know, were the Churchill family very emotional? And she said, oh yes, we used to cry a lot. We weren't at all stiff upper lip. And she said, that reminds me of something that happened at Potsdam, where my father and Stalin were talking. And while they were talking, someone came in with a memorandum for Churchill, and it said, it was a note, and it said one of his best friends had just died. And Churchill, who was very emotional, burst into tears. And while he was crying, he wiped his eyes and he said, Marshal Stalin, I have to apologize, because I know that it's absurd that the death of one person should make one weep, while you on the Eastern Front have lost so many millions of people, so I apologize. And Stalin said, no, I understand, because one death is a tragedy, but a million is just a statistic. How many more should we do? Yeah. Yeah, this question is, what was it about my book that annoyed the authorities? I think it was the revelation that the government of Russia was run almost like a mafia family. And that was the fascinating thing about it. There was a formal government in the Soviet Union of Stalin, Politburo, Central Committee, Congresses, and what have you. But actually, it was entirely intimate, personal. It was all about how close you were to Stalin himself. And all decisions...
We have a similar situation at the moment.
Do you?
In an odd sort of way.
Yeah. Where?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, one family.
Yes, one family. Yes. Yes, well,
Not quite so many firing squads.
No firing squads, I hope. Yes, but that's an interesting... You know, anyway, so everything was decided by that little group of people, like 4 or 5 people. And oftentimes, they plotted the deaths and murder of many people. So that's why they didn't like it in the new regime. Should we just... How many more do you think we should do? Two more questions. Yes, you. Yeah.
During the time of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, October, you said Stalin had been a communist for a really long time, but he wasn't quite under the radar at that point. He was not exiled. All the larger leaders of the revolution were in exile. Why do you think do you think it was his talent, but there was a part that was played by circumstances in how big a role he eventually came to play?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really important question. The point about Stalin was, actually, he had just been in exile. He just came back when the first revolution happened in 1917 that overthrew the Tsar. And Stalin was one of the top people. It was Trotsky who made out that he was, you know, played such a minor role. Trotsky was just as much of a liar as Stalin himself. But the interesting thing about Stalin was he had two different characteristics that are invaluable in a politician in a state at war. On one hand, he could organize. He could also write journalism. He was literate, thanks to his time at the convent, at the monastery, the seminary, where he learnt classic Russian and had a classical education, not unlike an English boarding school, in fact. But at the same time, Stalin had another talent, was that he could arrange what he called black work. And black work was having people assassinated, dealing with espionage, having people killed, organizing bank robberies. And the bank robbery is a story I want to tell you next time. But anyway, but he could do both these things. And these things were essential to Russian politics. When the Soviets took power in 1917, they were immediately attacked on all sides. The state was in extreme danger, and so extreme measures were called for. If it had become a democracy, if there hadn't been war, if there hadn't been a struggle for survival, another leader would have come to power. Maybe Bukharin, for example. But when the Civil War started and it became a ruthless battle of survival, then the most extreme politician with the most skill at black work was most likely to win over a bunch of Jewish intellectuals. And that's what happened. One more question. Sir, you.
My question is about the legacy of Stalin. In the heydays of the communist rule, they sort of ignored Stalin as if he didn't exist. Russia is now inherited from the Soviet Union, and Stalin belonged to Georgia. What legacy now remains in Russia and Georgia?
Well, that's an interesting question, and a good one to finish up on. The ironic thing about Stalin is Stalin, the great Soviet leader, the great Russian leader, the victor of the Great Patriotic War, is a Russian hero, and is a Russian leader and a Russian statesman, if you read these new textbooks in Russia today. But at the same time, we all know that Stalin was, in fact, Soso Jugashvili, a cobbler's son from Georgia. So in Georgia, they hate him, and they're greatly ashamed of it. I mean, yes, there's sort of patronizing rumors that there are a few kind of taxi drivers with Stalin's picture on their dashboards, but it's actually not true. Most Georgians now despise Stalin and have much more idea of his crimes than many Russians do. And Stalin himself regarded himself as a multiple nationality person. He was Georgian, he was Soviet, he was Russian, and he was an internationalist. So he had 5 different nationalities. And so that's a complicated question. I must finish it there. William, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for your lovely introduction. And thanks for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
Sebag will be signing books